In the winter of 1923, a German baker named Otto Krenwald watched the price of a single loaf of bread rise from 250 marks in the morning to over 200,000 marks by nightfall. He had spent 30 years building a small bakery that fed half his neighborhood, and now he could not tell if he was rich or ruined. Otto's shelves were full, his oven never stopped burning, yet every evening he rushed to spend his earnings within hours, because by morning, the same pile of paper money would buy almost nothing at all. This was not a story about scarcity, or war damage, or failed harvests. Germany still had wheat, still had workers, still had bakeries exactly like Otto's standing on every corner. What Germany did not have was a government willing to stop printing money to pay its debts. Every time the presses ran, another wave of currency spread across the country, and every wave made the marks already in people's pockets worth a little less. Otto did not understand economics. He understood flour, yeast, and the rent he owed on his shop. But he began to notice something strange happening to his neighbors, something that no textbook of the time had fully explained to ordinary people. The Wagner family down the street, factory workers who had spent decades carefully saving every spare mark for their daughter's future, watched those same savings become worthless within a single year. Meanwhile, a man named Heinrich Voss, who owed the bank a large sum for the land he had purchased just before the crisis began, paid off his entire debt with what amounted to pocket change by the time the presses were finished running. The Wagners had done everything right. They saved diligently, avoided debt, trusted the currency their government had issued them. Voss had done what many considered reckless, borrowing heavily and building a factory largely at the bank's expense. Yet inflation rewarded the borrower and punished the saver, turning decades of discipline into dust while erasing the obligations of those who owed the most. This was the part that Otto could not shake from his mind as he watched both families walk past his bakery window. Money printing had not created a single extra loaf of bread, not one more brick, not one more hour of honest labor in the entire country. It had simply decided, quietly and without any vote, who would keep what they had worked for and who would lose it. The government needed money it did not have, so it manufactured more of the paper representing wealth rather than the wealth itself. And because that paper could now be produced endlessly, while bread, land, and labor could not, the value drained out of every mark already sitting in a worker's pocket or a widow's savings account. Economists later gave this phenomenon a name, the inflation tax, though no politician ever called it that on the campaign trail. It was a tax with no legislation, no vote, and no signature, collected silently from anyone holding cash, while quietly forgiven for anyone holding debt. Otto began paying closer attention to who thrived during those brutal months and who collapsed. The wealthy industrialists who owned factories, land, and physical machinery watched the value of those assets rise alongside prices, because real things tend to track inflation rather than lose to it. The pensioners, the school teachers, the young couples who kept their life savings in a bank account watched their entire financial foundation evaporate within months. It was not laziness that destroyed the Wagners. It was not brilliance that saved Voss. It was simply a matter of what form their wealth happened to take on the day the printing presses accelerated beyond control. Cash lost. Property, debt, and hard assets won. This single insight, buried inside the chaos of a collapsing currency, would go on to shape the thinking of economists for the next century. Money, they realized, was never really wealth itself. It was only a claim on wealth, a piece of paper that promised a certain amount of bread, land, or labor in exchange. When a government printed more of those claims without producing more bread, land, or labor to back them, the claims already in circulation had to be worth less, because the underlying pie had not grown, even though the number of slices had multiplied. Otto's bakery survived that year, but barely, and only because he learned to convert his earnings into flour and firewood within hours of receiving them. He had stumbled, without any formal education, onto a truth that would define monetary policy debates for generations to come. Printing money does not create bread. It does not create factories, harvests, or working hands. It only decides, invisibly and often cruelly, whose bread gets bought first and whose savings quietly disappear. Otto never forgot the winter the presses ran without stopping. But the real turning point of the story wasn't Germany at all. It was decades later, half a world away, when a young economist named Priya Anand began studying why some countries recovered quickly from currency crises, while others spiraled into decades of poverty. Priya had grown up hearing her grandfather tell stories about a different kind of inflation, one that moved slower but was no less devastating, the kind that crept through Latin America in the 1980s. She wanted to know if Otto's Germany and her grandfather's Argentina were really telling the same story, just separated by 50 years and an ocean. What she found, buried in central bank records and dusty economic journals, confirmed something unsettling. Every hyperinflation in modern history followed the same basic script, regardless of language, culture, or continent. A government spent more than it collected in taxes, and rather than raising taxes or cutting spending, both politically painful choices, it simply asked the central bank to create the difference out of thin air. For a while, this trick seemed to work, because the first new money entering the economy didn't immediately show up as higher prices. There was a lag, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, during which the government could pay soldiers, fund projects, and cover its debts as if nothing had changed. Priya called this the illusion window, the brief period where printing felt like a solution rather than a postponement. But the illusion window always closed, because businesses and workers eventually noticed that prices were climbing faster than their wages. Once people expected prices to rise, they stopped waiting to spend their money. And that single behavioral shift was enough to turn a manageable problem into a runaway one. If a factory owner believed his supplies would cost 20% more next month, he raised his own prices today just to stay ahead. If a worker believed her paycheck would buy less by the time she cashed it, she demanded a raise immediately rather than waiting for the next review. This chain reaction had a name among economists, the inflationary spiral. And once it started, it fed itself without any further help from the government at all. Priya realized that printing money was never really about creating new resources. It was about redistributing claims on resources that already existed. Every new bill printed diluted the value of every bill already in circulation, the same way pouring more water into a glass of juice makes each sip weaker without adding any actual juice. This was the mechanism Otto had lived through without the vocabulary to describe it, and it was the same mechanism crushing families in Argentina, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela decades later. What struck Priya most was not the mechanism itself, but who kept winning and who kept losing across every single case she studied. Governments benefited first, because they got to spend the freshly printed money before prices had time to adjust, buying real goods and services at yesterday's cheaper rates. Banks and large corporations often benefited next, because they had the financial sophistication to convert cash into hard assets before the value disappeared. Ordinary savers, pensioners, and anyone paid a fixed wage were almost always last in line, receiving the diluted currency only after prices had already climbed to reflect its true worth. Economists sometimes called this the Cantillon effect, named after a French banker who noticed centuries earlier that new money doesn't spread through an economy evenly or instantly. It moves outward in waves, enriching those closest to the source and slowly losing strength before it reaches those farthest away. Priya began to see the printing press not as a machine that created wealth, but as a machine that quietly transferred wealth from the last person to receive the money to the first. This reframing changed how she read every headline about a government announcing a new stimulus funded by the central bank. The announcement always promised growth, jobs, and relief. But the deeper question, the one rarely asked in press conferences, was who would receive the money first and who would receive it last. She thought about Otto again, the baker who had no formal training in economics but had understood something profound through pure survival instinct. He had learned to spend his earnings within hours, converting paper into flour and firewood before the value could evaporate. Without knowing it, Otto had positioned himself closer to the front of the wave, protecting himself the same way industrialists and landowners had, simply by moving faster than the currency could lose its worth. Priya's research eventually led her to a harder question, one that would occupy the rest of her career. If printing money couldn't create real wealth, only move it around, why did so many governments keep reaching for the printing press during every crisis? The answer, she began to suspect, had less to do with economics and more to do with human nature, with the temptation to solve a visible problem today by creating an invisible one for tomorrow. Politicians rarely paid the political price for inflation immediately because the illusion window gave them just enough time to claim credit for the spending before the consequences arrived. By the time prices spiraled and voters grew angry, a different administration was often left holding the blame, a pattern that repeated itself with uncomfortable consistency across a dozen different countries and a dozen different decades. Priya began to wonder whether the real lesson of Otto's bakery, and of every hyperinflation that followed it, was not about money at all. It was about the gap between what looks like a solution in the short term and what actually solves anything in the long term. A gap that governments kept falling into again and again, no matter how many times history had already shown them exactly where it led. Priya spent the next several years trying to answer the question that had haunted her since graduate school. And the clearest answer came not from a textbook, but from a country that had done almost everything differently. In the early 1990s, a small nation grappling with runaway prices took a path that defied the usual playbook, one where politicians simply printed their way out of short-term pain. Instead, its central bank was granted independence from the government that funded it, meaning elected officials could no longer simply pick up the phone and demand more currency to cover their spending. This single structural change, separating the people who spent money from the people who created it, turned out to matter more than any single policy or personality. Priya studied the results carefully, comparing inflation rates before and after the separation, and the pattern was unmistakable. Countries where the central bank operated independently consistently avoided the worst spirals, while countries where politicians controlled the printing press directly seemed doomed to repeat Otto's Germany in one form or another. It wasn't that independent central banks were staffed by smarter people or protected by better luck. It was that removing the temptation, the ability to solve today's budget shortfall with tomorrow's inflation, forced governments to make harder choices earlier, when those choices were still manageable. Priya began presenting this research at conferences, and she noticed a recurring reaction from audiences full of policymakers and bankers. People nodded along easily when she discussed abstract mechanisms and historical case studies, but grew visibly uncomfortable when she connected those mechanisms to decisions being made in the very room they were sitting in. No one wanted to admit that stimulus packages, however necessary they seemed in a crisis, carried the same fundamental risk that Otto's government had ignored a century earlier. The risk wasn't that printing money would fail immediately. It was that it would appear to succeed just long enough for someone else to inherit the consequences. Priya eventually returned to Otto's story, the one her grandfather had passed down through his own memories of Argentina, and used it to explain her findings in language anyone could understand. She would ask her students a simple question. If a government could create infinite bread simply by printing more money, why did any country in history ever starve? The answer, once they thought about it, was obvious. Money was never bread. It was only a claim on bread. And printing more claims without producing more bread just meant dividing the same loaf into smaller and smaller pieces for everyone holding a claim. This was the sentence Priya returned to again and again in her lectures, the one she believed captured everything Otto had learned by instinct in his bakery. Wealth was built through real things. Factories that produced goods, farms that grew food, workers who developed skills, and ideas that created new value where none had existed before. Currency was simply the measuring tape used to track and exchange that real wealth. And stretching the tape didn't make anyone taller. It only made the measurements less honest. Governments that understood this distinction tended to grow steadily, funding their ambitions through taxation, borrowing, or genuine economic growth, all of which required real trade-offs and real accountability. Governments that ignored this distinction tended to chase short-term relief through the printing press, and in almost every case Priya studied, the relief was temporary while the damage compounded for years afterward. By the time Priya finished her decade of research, she had traced the same pattern across dozens of countries, from Weimar Germany to Zimbabwe, from Argentina to Venezuela, and the conclusion never changed. Printing money could redistribute wealth instantly and invisibly, rewarding those closest to the source and punishing those farthest from it. But it could never manufacture the wealth itself. She thought often about Otto, a man who never read a single economics paper in his life, but who had understood, through nothing but hunger and instinct, a truth that entire governments continue to relearn the hard way. His bakery had survived not because he mastered monetary theory, but because he recognized, faster than most, that the paper in his hand was only as valuable as everyone's shared belief in it. The moment that belief cracked, the paper became worthless, no matter how many zeros were printed across its surface. Priya's final lecture each year ended the same way, with a photograph of an old German banknote from 1923. Its denomination so large it seemed almost comedic against the small loaf of bread it could no longer buy. She would tell her students that the photograph wasn't really about Germany, or about history, or even about money itself. It was about a lesson every generation seemed destined to forget and rediscover: that no government, no matter how powerful, could print its way into genuine prosperity. Wealth had to be built, brick by brick, harvest by harvest, hour by honest hour, and no machine, no matter how fast it printed, could shortcut that process without quietly stealing from someone else to fake the illusion of progress. Otto's bakery closed decades ago, and the ovens that once burned through the night went cold long before Priya was born. But the lesson baked into that terrible winter of 1923 never went cold at all, and it kept reappearing in different currencies and different centuries, waiting patiently for the next government to forget it.